Hello there, you're watching Dansky, the place to be to develop your creative skills. In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to create an awesome text splash effect, all in Photoshop. Rightio, so we're now in Photoshop and you can see that I've opened up a few documents already. The first one we've got is our tutorial document. This is the main PSD file where we're going to be working. And you can go to File, down to New to create a new document. Now, depending on your version of Photoshop, this screen might look a bit different, but the important thing is that you create a new document that is 1920 by 1080. Well, in fact, actually, that's not important. You can create whatever size you like, but if you'd like to follow along, those are the sizes that I'm using. And we can set the background to, well, it doesn't really matter what color because we're going to actually add a new background color in a moment. So once you've got your new document, the next thing that we're going to get is a splash image. Now you can find all sorts of splash images by doing an image search on Google, or you can use third-party sites like Envato Elements that is linked in the description. And the reason that I like using Elements for something like this is because you can search their 3D library. So I've just typed splash here and you get a whole bunch of different splashes to choose from. But the best thing about this is if I were to click this one, for example, here, it loads up in a separate window and I can click the View 360 Render and it lets me rotate the angle. So depending on the text or the image or whatever it is I'm trying to create, I can actually adjust the angle of this splash to then suit that image. So I can rotate this until I'm happy, so something like that. And I can then download as a PNG or a PSD. Now downloading as a PNG is a lot quicker and you get this image at this angle, but it does come with a shadow as well, and that's part of the image. So for me personally, I like to download the PSD because it's a full layered file and I can switch off things like shadow really easily. Even if it is a bit larger and takes a bit longer to download, it just makes it so much easier. So I can jump into that now. So this is the PSD of the angle that I've downloaded. And as you can see, it comes with shadows and lots of other options and layers that you can switch on and off. We're just going to switch all of this off just so I can literally grab the splash itself. And I'm just going to right click on this and select duplicate layer and select the destination as our tutorial document. Now, if you have a splash that you've sourced on Google and it's not on a transparent background, like this one, for example, all you need to do is just grab something like the Magic Wand tool or the Quick Selection tool and just select the background and then just kind of cut it out that way. And I've done a few other tutorials on Photoshop cutouts, so you can follow those if you like. But the ultimate goal is to get this splash onto a transparent background like this. So we've added the splash. We can close this down now because we don't need this anymore. And I've also opened a silk effect. Now this is totally optional, but it's something that I will try and use later on in the tutorial. You can again search Google Images for silk, and or you could use stock image sites like Adobe Stock or Envato Elements, whatever you like, but something like this just to add a little bit of texture to the finished product. But anyway, we'll leave silk there for now and we'll jump straight into this. So I'm just going to double click on the layer name and call this splash, and we'll switch that one off for now. So the first thing I'm going to do is select the background, and from the bottom of the layers panel, click the adjustment icon, and we're going to add a new gradient. And you can see here it adds a default gradient, and we can click on this slider, and well, we can pick from any number of these wild presets here, or we can just start with black to white. And we can double click each of these swatches and then pick a color for the left and the right side of the gradient. So I'm going to click somewhere around the blue section of the hue slider and just bring this to the right and up a little bit. So I'm not going for pure black. I'm going to go for a very dark blue. And click OK. And then I'm going to double click on the white and do the same again. So hover around the blue section on the hue slider and then just go up a little bit. And you can see in real time my gradient changes, so I can preview how it's going to look. So we'll go for something like this. And of course we can adjust things like the angle and the direction as well if we want to, but I think for this, we're just going to have it going from top to bottom, and that is a linear gradient. So it goes from one direction, whether it's left to the right or top to the bottom. Now at the moment, you may notice that we've got something called banding appearing. Now this is when you use gradients, you can often get banding appear, and that's where there just aren't enough different colors to fill in the gaps in the colors, if that makes sense, and it just doesn't look smooth. So what we can do is we can check this box here called dither, and it just smooths that out. So sometimes when you're working with an image in 8 bits per channel, you can get a lot more banding. 16 bits usually can get around that and you get a lot less banding, but regardless of whether you do or don't get banding, just double click on that thumbnail and you've got that dither checkbox there that just helps smooth that out. It's just where Photoshop can't really reproduce enough different colors between those sections, and it just has those kind of hard divides called banding. But anyway, that's banding, and I'm actually going to lock this layer now here because I don't want to move that, and we don't need this background layer because that's underneath. So I'm just going to hit delete or backspace on the keyboard, and then just select the type tool and just left click anywhere on the canvas, and I'm going to type some text or a letter. In fact, this can be anything you want, and I'm just going to make this considerably bigger. And you can of course scale this by going to edit, free transform, and just hold shift and scale up or down. And you can pick any font you like, any letter. I'm using Gotham Bold for this tutorial, and we could use a variety of different letters. You can use logos, you could do this with anything, photos, but I'm going to use a nice round 0. And then just adjust your font properties so you're happy. So we'll make that again a little bit bigger, and just make sure it's in the center because of course we absolutely have to. And then I'm just going to double click on this layer name and call it text, just so I don't forget. It is entirely possible that I forget. So we've got our letter. This is what we're going to be adding our splash effect to. And next we're going to right click on the layer and go to blending options, and it will bring up this screen here. I'll try and move this out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. Now the first screen we land on is the blending options screen, and we're just going to take that fill opacity and drag this down. So because we started off with some black text, we can drop that down. Something else you can also do is just bring that all the way down, add a color overlay, pick a color of your choice, so that might be black, and then just bring the opacity down here. It doesn't matter which one you use. Ultimately we still get the same effect. So I'm going to go for, let's go for something like, we'll start with 15. But remember, this is all still editable. So when I click OK, it's listed here under effects, and I can turn this on and off. Oh yeah, there we go. So you can adjust the fill from here quickly as well, rather than having to go into the blending options screen. So we've got our text and we've adjusted that. Now we're going to add an inner shadow to our text as well. The goal of this is to create a little bit of depth, so it looks like the letter, that area here, is inset a little bit from the background. So again, we can right click and select blending options, and then check the inner shadow box. Now these are the settings that I've got at the moment. You can of course adjust the opacity, make it a lot harder or a lot softer. You can change the angle. In fact, I think I'm going to go with 135 on the angle. So as I increase the distance here, you can see it becomes a little bit one-sided, which is fine, but we're going to keep it quite subtle. If I take the distance to 0, it just looks equal around all the edges, and I'd like to have just a little bit of an offset there. So I'm just going to throw that off, so something like 4 or 5. And the size, well, this is how much blur we get, so we want to keep this quite low as well. Not down at 0 because it will be just way too hard, but if we bring it up a little bit and drop that opacity down to something subtle like this. But we can always keep it a bit less subtle while we work on it, because once we click OK, it's just listed as another effect. So we can easily just go straight back into those blending options and just tweak it some more. And to be honest, that's how this process, for me at least, goes quite a lot of the time. It's very much a, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward kind of process where you just iterate and iterate until you get something you're happy with. Right, so we've got our letter, we've added that inner shadow, and we've adjusted the fill opacity. Now the next thing to do is actually add our splash. So we can switch this layer on here. And you can see the example that I'm using here, it has a tiny bit of transparency to it. Now that's not really an issue because this is a smart object. If your image isn't a smart object, just right click and select Convert to Smart Object, and then you can double click on the thumbnail and it takes you inside. Now I'm just going to do something really quick here. Just right click and duplicate this layer a couple of times. Now because this has a little bit of transparency to it, if I'm duplicating it over and over again, eventually it will become a little bit more opaque. So we'll do this a few times, and you can see here as I've layered up these different copies, it just becomes a lot less transparent, and you could leave a little bit of transparency in there if you want. And then we can close this down. So this is a .psb file. This is a smart object within our main document. So once I click save, it will close this down. It will take me back to the main document and it will just update any changes that I make. So that's why smart objects are pretty cool. Just double click it, go inside, make any changes, save it, close it, and then you're back to the main document. So it's like a way of storing files within files. Now at the moment the splash is incredibly large, so we're going to need to scale this down. And we can hold shift so we don't skew it out of proportion. And then we can position these where they're going to be. Now I could drag this splash across the entire thing. Although I did this when I was rehearsing the tutorial and this side looked alright, but the left side just wasn't working. So what we're going to do is we're going to do these individually. So the right hand side. So I'm just going to rotate this now and try and visualize where the splash is going to be. So everything underneath this area on the right here is going to be filled with this splash liquid, and then everything above it is going to just be left like this as you see it now. So I think the right side position looks pretty good there, so I can just double click or press return to set that transformation, and then I'm going to duplicate the splash again. Now I'm going to call the one underneath right, and then double click the name of the one above and call it left, just so we don't get the lefts and the right mixed up, which is entirely possible. Okay, so let's click on that right layer. Now we're going to hold down Command or Control on the keyboard and just hover over the thumbnail for our text layer. And you'll see this icon appears next to the hand. And if we left click, it will select that letter or the shape that you started with. And with the right layer selected, we can click the Add Layer Mask icon from the bottom of the Layers panel. And it will do something like this. In fact, I'm going to name these right splash and left splash, just so we don't get confused with terminology. Okay, so this is the right splash layer. So what I'm going to do now is select the layer mask and make sure that I've got black. That's all the way in the bottom left corner is selected as my foreground color. Remember, when we brush into a mask with black, it removes it. When we use white, it adds to it. And you can swap those black and white colors by pressing X on your keyboard. So with black selected as the foreground color and the brush tool, we're going to grab one of Photoshop's default soft round brushes. You can adjust that slider here. And we've got a hardness of 0%, which is fantastic. And because this layer here is the right splash, we're going to use black to just remove anything on the left side. Now we can press X on the keyboard to swap our foreground and background color. So now you can see white becomes our active color, and we want to keep the splash over here that goes outside, so we're going to brush in over here. Now we don't want to do this and brush in because of course we're not going to see any of that. Imagine that all of this area here is going to be filled with this same white milk-like liquid. Okay, so we've done that one side. Let's just switch this off and switch on the left side. So now what I can do is go to Edit, Free Transform, and just focus on exactly where I want this next splash to be. And we can flip this around horizontally as well. So it's just about trying to visualize where it's going to be and adjust the rotation. And I think I may have actually made it worse. I'm going to flip that one back. And if it helps, you can switch on your right splash as well, just to kind of visualize the link between the two sides. Because if we have this down here and this up here, it just doesn't really work. We need this to kind of at least flow a little bit, like it's on the level. And this may just take a moment. So when you're doing this, as I say, just try and visualize that this bottom area will be completely full. So let's try something like this. So both sides are splashing up. Okay, so remember what we did last time? We've positioned our splash where we want it to be. We just have to hold Command or Control and click on the text layer thumbnail. It selects the layer, and then we add a layer mask from the bottom of the layers panel, and we're adding this to our left splash. Now any of this down here, we don't need that. So we just use black as our foreground color and the brush tool to brush that away. And then we press either X on the keyboard, or we just select white in the top left corner. And we want to brush in what we want to keep. So we want to keep all of this splash out here. And we can then use black again, I guess, to just brush away this, because we don't need all of this continuing down here. And because we're using a nice soft feathered brush, we can really have a nice graduation on here, rather than like a hard straight cut. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is click on our text layer and then add a new color adjustment layer from the bottom of the layers panel. So it's going to be a solid color layer, and we'll just pick any color for now. It doesn't really matter. We'll just switch that off, and then we can double click or single click. You can double click if you like on the thumbnail for the color layer, and we're going to sample one of the colors from our splash. Now it doesn't need to be perfect, but let's just click OK anyway. And it looks something like this, and you can see, of course, this color fill layer applies to the whole image and completely covers our text and our background. So what we need to do is just delete this layer mask here by right clicking on it and selecting delete layer mask. Hold Command or Control on the text layer, and then click on color fill and add that layer mask, and it will add, well, it will mask off this color that we've selected only to the letter. And of course we can go back and change it by double clicking on the thumbnail if we like. And then what we can do is select the mask, and with black we're going to brush out this top area. Remember, this fill, this splash is only going to be the lower half, so we can remove all of this using black and the brush tool. And you'll see we're left with these hard edges. That isn't an issue because we can just click on the mask for the right side to start with, and we'll use that same soft feathered brush, and we can adjust the brush size by using the left and right square brackets on the keyboard. And we're simply just going to soften that edge. So I'm just removing this bit here, and we'll use a nice small brush for the corner. And what this looks like is just that. That's all I'm doing. So I'm just taking that hard edge and just softening it, similar to what we did here already. So we're just doing it along this left edge now. So I'm just removing the lower part of the splash, but because I'm using a nice soft brush, it just blends the color of the splash seamlessly into the color we've used here. Now, if you have a splash that is one color, let's say yellow, and you want it to be red, don't worry, we can change the color at the end, but at the moment it's important that you get your lettering, your fill color down here as close as you can to the splash, so it looks something like this, and they blend together really nicely. Okay, cool. So we've added our letter, we've got the splash in place on both sides. Now there's a few more things that we can do. Now we're going to try and use this silk layer here. So let's go to select all. You'll see the marching ants appear. indicating the entire canvas is selected, and edit, copy, and then we can go edit, paste in our main document. And then we can double click on the layer and we'll call this silk. And again, this is a huge image, so we're just going to go free transform and hold shift to scale this down. Now, using silk like this is entirely up to you. It's completely optional, but for me, I find it just adds a little bit of texture. You can see over here, we've got something that is a little bit silky when it's kind of blended into the letter. So adding a little bit more silk just down the bottom, I don't know, to me, I think it just can help add a little bit more texture to what we've created. So let's just shrink this down a little bit more. And I think I'll do a bit on the right, and then we'll duplicate this layer. We'll go edit, transform, flip horizontal, and we'll maybe add some more on the left here. So something like that. We'll see how we go. So we'll start on the right first. And what we're going to do is right click on the silk layer and select blending options. And again, I'll try and move this out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. So from the main blending options screen, we have the blend if section at the bottom, and we can drag these sliders here, but it generally does look a bit rubbish if we do that. So if we hold down the Alt key on the keyboard, we can left click on the left part of this slider, and it will allow us to separate it. And this will help blend the lighter colors, the whites, the highlights into the image. And we can also hold down Alt and separate the shadows as well. So we can bring these two up and just bring these down a little bit here. And if I just preview, so that's the change that we've made. It just helps blend that into the background, the fill color a little bit more. And we can click OK. Now we've still got this area outside, but that's fine. All we do is we hold down Command or Control, as we've done before, hover over the thumbnail for the text layer, left click and you get those marching ants. And we just add a layer mask from the bottom of the layers panel. And if it does make a selection of the other way around or anything, that's fine. You can just invert that by going to Image, Adjustments, and Invert, and it will invert your mask. Now, of course, we've got these hard edges here. This isn't looking particularly smooth, but as we've done before, we can just use the mask. And with that brush tool and black as our foreground color, we can just brush this all in. So a nice large brush, and just brush that in, and you can see what that's done there is just kind of give this a little bit more texture. And we can do something similar with this on the left. So what we can actually do is right click on our first silk layer and go copy layer style. This will copy those blending options that we adjusted. Remember, we changed the blend if section here. It will copy that, and we can go right click and paste layer style. So that gives us a head start. And we can then hold Command or Control, select the thumbnail on our text layer and add a layer mask. And again, using the brush tool and black, we'll just brush into that mask. Something like this, which kind of connects quite well actually here with the flow. That's a little bit of a win there. So you can see I'm moving this around now. It does move that, which doesn't work. So we need to unlink the layer from the mask. When they're unlinked, the mask will stay in exactly the same place. And we can move this texture around. So that's pretty good actually. That's worked pretty well. Now, something else that we're going to need to do is try and match the color of this silk texture to the fill here that we can see below, because at the moment this is a little bit different. So what we can do is we'll start with the right side, and we can go to Image, Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. Now at the moment these are very, very white. So I'm going to try and increase the saturation and just drop the lightness ever so slightly. So you can see that slight change there. This is how it looks where it's very light. And I've just made that change. Now I'm going to make a mental note of what I've done here. So plus 36 on the saturation, minus 7 on the lightness. So remember, we are still trying to keep everything that we're adding here all in the same color. If we can change the color of it all at the end, but at the moment we want this to all kind of flow together nicely. So I can then select the next layer here. So in fact, I'm going to call these silk left and right because you know I'm going to get them mixed up. So silk left is selected. We'll go to image adjustments, hue and saturation. And let's just check that these do work on this side as well. 36 on the saturation and -7 on the lightness. We can go and tweak that a little bit more. So you can see if I get this a bit too wrong, that hard edge becomes visible. But we can always go back onto our mask layer and just brush that out. So that is the beauty of masks. You still have all the flexibility you need when working with them. So we've just added a little bit of texture there. Now you could go and add a lot more or a lot less. You could refine it, tweak it, but it just kind of helps just add more texture to this splash effect. And this is quite a nice continuation down the left here as well. And even after we've done all this, we can just select both of those layers by holding Shift and left clicking and just drop that opacity. So I think I'll have the left one, just bring that down so it's a bit more subtle like the right side. So we'll go for something around 40 on the left and 80% opacity on the right. So it's all really, really nice and subtle. In fact, I'm going to select the left layer and go to filter and blur and Gaussian blur and just add a very, very subtle blur as well. So let's preview that. There we go. Just to help blend it in. And I've just noticed this bit here. So now it's just finding out where that is. So that's on our left splash layer. And that's a really good way to actually detect where issues are. So if you come across something like this and you think, oh, okay, I need to correct that, just switch layers off individually until you find the problem layer. So I'm just brushing into that mask with black. So there's no eraser tool or anything in this. It's all just done using masks and using black and white to brush into or out of layer masks. And if you don't understand what layer masks are, what I'll do is I'll try and link a tutorial to layer masks at the top of the screen now, just because layer masks are awesome and it's definitely worth learning them. Anyway, that's enough enthusiasm about layer masks. They are amazing, but let's carry on. So we've got our splash effect. It's coming together pretty well, I think. And the next thing we're going to do now is left click on the top layer. So our silk left, hold Shift and left click on this one here. So color fill. So it selects all of those and we're going to right click and convert these to a smart object. And we can then double click and give this a name. So we'll call it splash. And you might be thinking, well, that is one layer now, Dan. You've just merged all of those together. Remember, smart objects are incredibly useful, so we can double click the thumbnail for our smart object and it takes us inside of it. All of this is still fully editable. What it does is it just packages it nicely inside one layer. So this is great for kind of keeping your layers organized when you have 100,000 layers, but also it means that we can do this next thing I'm going to do, and that is, this is quite a hard edge here. You know, this is a 3D render. We created this letter in Photoshop. Everything at the moment for me is just looking too perfect, a bit too sharp or a bit jaggedy around the edges. So something I like to do is just go to filter, down to blur, and we'll add a Gaussian blur. And you can also use blur and blur more. Now the amount of blur that you're going to use depends on the size of your image. So you can see for this image, 1 pixel of blur, already way too much. So we'll start at 0.1 and we'll just go up by 0.1 of an increment. So we'll start with that. We'll go to 0.3. Now the reason I like to just add a tiny bit of blur is because, well, this is a splash. So there is some kind of motion. So it kind of makes sense that this wouldn't be perfectly in focus, but it also just, it takes away some of that perfection and just helps it look a bit more realistic. Now the reason that this is a smart filter is because we created a smart object. So that's the main reason that I did this, is because it keeps our layers organized, which is great, but it also means that we can add filters to this and it lists them and we can turn those on and off. If this wasn't a smart object, it would apply that blur, and that's that. That would be the end of it. So now we can double click this and I can actually go 0.2 I think is a bit more suitable, and I can change that. So that's really, really helpful. And I'm going to do the same thing with the text as well. So right click on the text layer, convert to smart object, and I'm going to go and add the same amount of blur to that. And you can see it's listed under here, and we can collapse and expand that. So I think we'll collapse that. We don't really need to see that listed anymore. Fantastic. Okay, so we've now got our splash effect. We can turn these off and on individually, looking pretty good. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually add the color. So we can click on our top layer, which is splash, and go to the adjustment icon at the bottom and add a solid color layer. And let's just pick any color for now, so bright red. And what we can do is change this to multiply. Now that looks great, but it does apply it to everything that is below it. So it applies it to the background, the text, everything. We want this layer to only affect the splash layer. So what we can do is right click on this, go down to create clipping mask, and you'll see that it only applies that color to the layer directly below it. And it has this arrow here indicating that, and the layer that it is applied to has an underline. And then we can double click on that thumbnail again where the color is and change this to whatever we want. So this is pretty cool now. So we can go for something lighter, we could go white, maybe not black, but let's go for like a really nice vibrant color for now. We'll see how we go. Click OK, and we've used the multiply blending mode as well. You can try other blending modes as well, and you'll get slightly different effects. But if you want to be able to pick a color in the color picker here, and then have that color recreated on your splash, this is the most effective way to do it. Now you may find when you do this, it does darken your color ever so slightly, and we can see that we've lost a little bit of detail on the splash as well. So we can actually bring that back in. So if we click on our splash layer and add a new adjustment layer from the bottom of the layers panel, we can go to levels. Now because we've added this in between the splash layer and the color layer, it will automatically make this a clipping mask. You can see with the arrow there, and you can stack as many clipping masks on top of each other as you like. If it doesn't, remember, just right click and create clipping mask, and it will apply that to the splash layer below. And now what we can do is start to adjust these sliders. So we'll bring those shadows down. And you can see you can really go to the extreme here. So we don't want to go too much, do too crazy, but we can bring those down a good bit. And bring up the highlights. Now this will brighten it, but it will start to remove some of that detail. So we can get a brighter yellow by bringing the highlights up. And then we can find that perfect balance by adjusting the midtones in the middle. But remember, this is all fully adjustable, so we can double click on that thumbnail and it's all there if we need to fine tune it later on. So remember, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's how I like to work anyway. Lots and lots of iteration. So I get most of what I'm doing done like this, and then I spend a lot more time just tweaking everything. And so it looks amazing. Okay, so we've added the color. Awesome. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit more texture to the graphic overall. Remember, we don't want it to be too perfect. So if we just click on our bottom layer, and what we're going to do is go add adjustment icon, solid color, pick any color, it doesn't matter because we're going to remove it instantly anyway. And we'll just drag that fill all the way to the left. And we're going to call this layer pattern. And we can right click on this and select blending options. And we're going to go down to pattern overlay and check that box. And you'll see I've got a selection of patterns here. Now you might see some completely different ones by default, but if you click on the cog and go to artist surfaces, you will see some of these and you can click through them. Make sure you've got multiply as the blend mode and opacity at 100%. You can click through them and see different kinds of textures that we can add to our image. Now some might be more relevant than others. Let's go for something like this one here. And we can zoom in And you can adjust the scale if you want to. So if you make it larger, it will start to pixelate, or we could make it a bit smaller so that texture is a little bit finer and a bit more detailed. And we can adjust the opacity as well. So I'm going to bring this down to 50% and click OK. So we've just added some texture to our graphic. Although I'm going to drag this layer above the text layer because I want to apply this to everything except the splash. So we've got all of our splash layers here. In fact, we can group these together now, so we can select them holding Shift and go Layer, Group Layers. So we're keeping everything nice and organized. And then we have our background at the bottom, we have our text layer here, and then we have our pattern on top. And we can lock that pattern layer. So everything underneath the pattern layer is going to have that nice pattern applied to it. And we can of course right click and just go back into the pattern overlay screen if we want to adjust the opacity, make it a bit less visible or a bit more visible. And then we've got our splash here as well. Now there's one last thing that I'm going to do, and that is add a new layer. Grab the brush tool, and I'm just going to add a few splashes of my own. Now, if you don't have this particle brush, which is quite likely, what I'll do is I'll add a link in the description where you can download it, or you can follow a tutorial that is linked at the top of the screen now on a card, where I show you how to go and create this particle brush. Not this brush here doing that, but it is a particle brush that we're going to use in a moment. So what we're going to do is switch off all of these color adjustment layers. And we're going to drag this new layer. Let's drag this under our splash, because we don't want to drag it above it, because we don't want these colors to affect it, not just yet. Okay, so I'm going to use the eyedropper tool, and I'm just going to sample this same color. And drawing with this particle brush does that, which is no good whatsoever. So if we go to Window and down to Brush Settings, we get this screen appear here, and we can check Shape Dynamics. We can check Scattering, and look at the preview at the bottom. That's the brush we're using at the moment, which is not really that useful. But if we increase the scattering, it completely randomizes how this brush is brushed onto this layer. So I'll double click this layer, and I'm going to call it particles. And we can adjust the size of the brush using the left and right square brackets on the keyboard. And as we brush, you can see it brushes completely randomly. Now this brush was designed as a particle brush with effects like snow and things and actual light particles in mind, but you can use this for this. So we've got our scatter on, and we can just left click and just brush here or there. Now doing this bit and getting it right takes a lot more time and finesse to really get it looking good. In fact, for me, I like to add different layers for different areas, because then what I can do is I can move each of those layers around individually. I can erase any particles that kind of double up or don't look a little bit right. So at the moment I've got particles 2 and particles 1, and you can add like loads of particles layer, lots of different brush effects and all that, group them together in a particles folder if you like. So that's how it looks without them. That's how it looks with them. So that's me doing it very quickly, but you can finesse that a lot more. But now if we switch back on these layers here, you can see our particles, well, they're not actually affected by those same color adjustments. So there's a few different things we can do. We could double click our splash here, and we could go into this and edit it, but it's kind of cropped, so the particles wouldn't be able to go out here. And we could change the size of the canvas, but then when you change the canvas size, it can move this from your main document. So I think one thing that we are going to do is grab these 2 layers by holding Shift and left clicking. And I'm just going to move these up here. So you can see now we've actually lost our particles. They've disappeared. That's because they're being clipped with the clipping mask to the splash layer underneath. So I'll move these above, and I can right click on both of them and select release clipping mask. And now they're released. So now they're still white again. So this is a bit of an issue. Now the way that we get around this just requires a little bit of layer moving adjustment. That's not even a word, but we'll drag the particles out here. And we'll drag the color adjustments up here. So we're just going to restructure everything. So we'll go and add the particles into our splash folder. So in our splash folder now we have our main splash, and we've got all of those particles like this. So those are all together in the splash folder, and then we have our adjustment layers. Now rather than applying those adjustment layers only to the splash layer, we're going to apply both of them to the splash folder. So we can hold shift and select both of these adjustment layers, right click and select create clipping mask, and you can do that as well. So you can apply adjustment layers to both individual layers and folders. So you can see here they're now pointing down, the splash folder is underlined, and our particles are now visible. Now the reason we've structured it like this is because we want as much flexibility as possible. So I can double click on this color thumbnail and change the color, and it changes the color of not only the splash but anything else in that folder, so our particles and any other brush effects that we've applied. And the same for our levels. We can go into this and we can fine tune that, and it applies it to everything that we've already done. So there we go, we have our background color, our gradient, we have our text that we added with an inner shadow, we've got that pattern layer layered over the top, we've added our splash and our particle brushes, and then we've fine-tuned the levels on that and added our own custom color fill there so we can quickly and easily change the color. And there we go, that's how to create an awesome text splash effect all in Photoshop. As always guys, please feel free to leave any questions or comments down below. Like this video if you enjoyed it, take care, and I'll see you next time.